The night Vanessa Clark was supposed to change the future. The future broke first. She was standing in the center of the Nexus Grand Convention Hall, the largest technology exhibition stage in the country, wearing a charcoal blazer that cost more than most people's monthly rent, her dark hair pulled back in a way that said she had not left anything to chance. Not tonight. Not ever. Behind her, suspended inside a massive circular frame of reinforced glass and brushed titanium, the cosmic sphere rotated slowly in its magnetic housing, throwing arcs of cold blue light across the faces of 400 investors, government officials, and technology journalists who had each paid their own form of currency to be in this room. Some had paid money, some had paid loyalty, some had paid years of patience, waiting to see if the thing Vanessa Clark kept promising was real. Tonight was the answer. Tonight was supposed to be the answer. Vanessa Clark was 32 years old, and she had been described in 11 separate magazine profiles as the most dangerous woman in aerospace technology. She did not disagree with that assessment. She had built Orbit Crest Technologies from a 9-person startup operating out of a converted warehouse into a company currently valued at $6.4 billion, and she had done it in 6 years, which was the kind of timeline that made other CEOs either furious or reverent. She did not particularly care which. What she cared about was the cosmic sphere, the crown jewel, the product that was going to redefine how humanity harvested and distributed energy from low orbit, the technology that was going to make everything else in her portfolio look like a rehearsal. The contracts waiting to be signed that night represented $2 billion. The government delegates from 3 separate agencies were seated in the third row. Everything was in place. Ethan Mercer arrived at the convention hall at 5:45 in the morning, when the caterers were still unloading, and the only people inside were the setup crew. He wore the gray uniform of Premier Facilities Group, the contracted cleaning and maintenance company, and he carried a standard-issue tool bag that had a broken zipper on the left pocket. He moved quietly through the back corridors the way people move through spaces they expect no one to notice them in. He had been assigned to the electrical maintenance corridor beneath the main stage, a long, low-ceiling tunnel that ran parallel to the primary power distribution grid. The job was simple. Check the secondary coupling relays, replace 2 outdated circuit breakers that the venue's own maintenance team had flagged, and be gone before the morning rehearsal. He crouched in the corridor for the better part of 2 hours, working with a precision that seemed slightly mismatched with the gray uniform and the broken zipper on his tool bag. He did not look at the stage above him. He did not look at the cosmic sphere glowing faintly through the access grate in the ceiling. He just worked. By the time the rehearsal began upstairs, he had moved to the main hall and was mopping the floor near the far wall, invisible the way all service workers are invisible, present and unregistered, like furniture with a heartbeat. The system failure happened at 7:14 in the evening, 11 minutes into Vanessa's keynote address. She had been mid-sentence, something about orbital energy yield projections, when every screen in the hall went red simultaneously, not the soft amber of a warning. Red, the deep, arterial red of a critical system fault. The cosmic sphere, which had been rotating with perfect, meditative calm, stuttered, then stopped. Then, its interior lights began to pulse in a pattern that anyone with a technical background would recognize immediately as a cascading failure sequence. The sound in the room changed. The ambient hum of excitement went flat, replaced by the specific silence of 400 people processing the same information at the same time, and not liking what they were processing. Vanessa stopped speaking. For 1 full second, she stood exactly as she had been composed, controlled, projecting absolute authority, and then she turned to look at the sphere, and something behind her eyes went very still. Her engineering director, Marcus Webb, was already at the control panel, and fingers moving across the interface with the focused speed of someone who had rehearsed this possibility in theory, but never expected to live it in practice. Within 90 seconds he had been joined by 5 other engineers, then 8, then the full technical team, all of them crouching and typing and speaking in the clipped shorthand of people who understood exactly what they were looking at and were not able to fix it. Marcus looked up at Vanessa once. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. She had been reading technical team expressions for 6 years. She knew what that look meant. It meant, "We don't know." It meant, "This is deeper than we can reach from here." It meant, the investors in the third row are watching us, and we are visibly failing in front of them. Vanessa walked back to center stage, with the particular composure of someone swallowing something very large and very jagged. She tried humor, first made a comment about live demos being the universe's way of keeping engineers humble. It landed poorly. She tried reassurance next, said they were running a quick diagnostic, said the team was on it, said they'd have the system back online in minutes. The investors did not look reassured. Senator Caldwell from the Federal Energy Oversight Committee leaned toward his aide and said something quietly. Vanessa saw it. She saw all of it. And through all of it, she maintained the expression she had spent a decade perfecting, the one that said she was in control, even when she was not. It was during this that she noticed Ethan. He was near the side entrance of the stage area, mop in hand, watching the chaos with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It was not the blank look of someone uninvested. It was not the wide-eyed look of someone frightened or thrilled by the spectacle. It was something quieter than either of those things, something more like recognition. He was watching the cosmic sphere the way you watch something you know very well behaving, in a way you have predicted it might. Vanessa was not in the habit of looking at janitors, but she was in the habit of reading people. And something about the way this particular man was looking at her $2 billion machine made her stop, just briefly, in the middle of her own crisis. She said it before she thought it through. That was the part she would return to. Later, the fact that she didn't decide to say it, she just said it, which meant it came from somewhere below the level of careful calculation. "If you can fix that," she said, and the microphone was still live, and the room heard every word, "I'll marry you." The laughter was immediate and general. It broke the tension, the way laughter always can in rooms full of frightened people. It gave everyone permission to exhale. Vanessa smiled too. The way a performer smiles when a joke lands, and she was already moving on, already turning back to Marcus. When the man with the mop spoke, "What if I actually can?" the laughter thinned. Vanessa turned back around. The man was not smiling. He was not performing. He was asking a direct question and waiting for a direct answer with the patience of someone who had asked questions in rooms full of people who didn't listen to him before. The silence stretched for 3 seconds. Then Vanessa Clark said, "Then by all means." And Ethan Mercer walked onto the stage. The room watched him the way rooms watch things they have not been prepared for. He moved without urgency, without performance, without any of the self-consciousness that the moment seemed to demand. He set down his mop against the side panel and walked to the control interface, where Marcus and his team were still huddled, and he stood there for a moment, just looking at the screens. Marcus looked up at him with an expression that was equal parts contempt and exhaustion. "Can I help you?" The question had a specific architecture. It was built to communicate that help was not what was being offered. "You need to clear your team from the panel," Ethan said. "Excuse me?" Every unauthorized input for the last 40 minutes is compounding the fault sequence. "I need the panel clean." Marcus looked at Vanessa. Vanessa was watching Ethan with the expression of someone doing rapid and involuntary reassessment. She nodded once. Marcus stepped back. His team stepped back. The look on Marcus's face was the look of a man who was doing this only because the alternative was worse, and who was composing his objections in real time for delivery later. Ethan sat down at the control interface. He looked at the system status for approximately 4 seconds. Then he said, almost to himself, "You're still running the original transfer protocol." He typed a sequence that no one in the room recognized. Not Marcus, not the 5 senior engineers, not the 3 specialists who had been flown in specifically for this event. The sequence was long and contained segments of code that several of the engineers would later describe separately and without coordination, as unlike any architecture they had encountered before, more elegant. They said, like someone had written the original language of the system rather than learned it. Ethan entered the sequence, paused, reached into the hardware panel beneath the interface, and made a single manual adjustment to a component that was about the size of a deck of cards, then sat back and waited. The cosmic sphere pulsed once. Then its light steadied. The rotation resumed smooth, controlled, exactly as it had been. The red screens went green one by one, from the outer ring inward, until every display in the hall was showing clean data and stable readings. The magnetic housing recalibrated with a sound like a deep, satisfied breath. And then the sphere was simply there, beautiful and perfect. As though nothing had happened at all. The silence lasted almost 5 seconds. Then the room came back to life. And it was not the polite, cautious noise of people managing their expectations, it was the genuine, involuntary sound of 400 people being surprised. Ethan stood up from the panel. He picked up his mop from where he had left it. He was already starting to move toward the side exit when Marcus Webb, still at the edge of the stage, said something in a voice that had lost all of its earlier contempt. What remained was something rawer and more uncertain. That sequence, Marcus said. The only people who know that code are the ones who wrote the original core architecture. Ethan did not answer. He was almost at the exit. But Vanessa Clark was not watching him go. She was watching his left wrist, where his sleeve had ridden up during the work at the panel. And on the inside of his wrist, in clean dark lines, was a tattoo she had seen exactly once before in her professional life on a framed photograph in the Orbit Crest archive room, in a picture taken 8 years ago of the original 5-person team that had built the first prototype. It was the sigil, the founding mark, the symbol that had become the center of the Cosmic Sphere's logo, which meant it was now on every piece of Orbit Crest marketing material in existence, and which had originated, according to company history, with the creative lead of the original prototype team, a man who had disappeared from the company and from the industry before Vanessa had ever joined. She looked at the tattoo on Ethan Mercer's wrist. She looked at the cosmic sphere rotating serenely behind her, and something in the architecture of everything she thought she knew developed a crack. Vanessa Clark was not a woman who slept easily under normal circumstances. That night, she did not sleep at all. She had her assistant pull the personnel file for Ethan Mercer, Premier Facilities Group employee number 4471, by 9 o'clock the same evening. The file was thin in a way that felt deliberate rather than merely sparse. Temporary contract. No listed academic credentials beyond a general equivalency certificate. No prior employment history that amounted to anything, a few short-term maintenance jobs, each lasting between 3 and 8 months, spanning the last several years. No professional network. No digital presence that her team's search tools could locate. He was, on paper, exactly what he appeared to be, a man who cleaned floors and fixed minor electrical issues, and left no impression on the systems of record that track the movement of people through professional life. She called the head of her corporate intelligence team at 11 that night and told him to go deeper. What he found, by 2 in the morning, was the crack becoming a fracture. 8 years earlier, Orbit Crest Technologies had not yet existed under that name. It had been a research collective called Helix Dynamics. And it had been founded by 5 people. 3 engineers, 1 materials scientist, and 1 theoretical physicist who was, by all available accounts from that period, the intellectual center of the entire enterprise. His name was Ethan Cole. He had been 24 years old. He had designed what became the foundational architecture of the cosmic sphere, the energy transfer protocol, the magnetic containment framework, the distributed processing core that allowed the system to operate at orbital efficiency levels that no competing technology had come close to replicating since. He had built the first working prototype in a facility so small and underfunded that other engineers in his field, when they heard about it years later, expressed open disbelief that it had been possible. He had done it, and it had worked, and it had been real. And then, he had vanished. Vanessa drove to the Orbit Crest archive storage facility at 2:30 in the morning with her access card and a coat over her pajamas, and the specific, focused energy of someone who needs to see something with their own eyes, rather than hear about it from a screen. The archive room was cold and fluorescent, and smelled of document preservation chemicals. And she went straight to the filing system for the Helix Dynamics acquisition period, which she had always understood as a straightforward corporate absorption, a small research group brought under the Orbit Crest umbrella when the larger company was being formed. She pulled the acquisition records. She pulled the intellectual property transfer documentation. She pulled the founding team files. She read for 2 hours in the cold fluorescent room, and by the time she was done, she was sitting on the floor with documents spread around her like evidence at a crime scene. Because that, she understood now, was exactly what it was. Ethan Cole had not left willingly. Ethan Cole had been pushed carefully, legally, with every paper signed correctly, and every clause technically enforceable. His wife, a woman named Sarah, had developed a serious illness in the early period of the company's formation. The treatment costs had been catastrophic. The investors who controlled Helix Dynamics had known this. They had timed the pressure. They had offered Ethan Cole a choice: sign the intellectual property transfer agreement, receive a cash settlement sufficient for his wife's medical care, and walk away, or contest it, and watch the legal process consume both time and money he did not have while his wife got sicker. He had signed. Of course he had signed. He had signed because he was a husband before he was an inventor, and because the people on the other side of the table had understood that and used it with the precision of surgeons. Sarah Cole had died 14 months after the transfer was signed. Vanessa sat on the archive room floor and looked at the photograph of Ethan Cole from the founding team picture, young, sharp-eyed, smiling with the specific joy of someone who has just proved that the impossible thing they were working on was not, in fact, impossible. And she understood something about the man who had mopped the floors of her convention hall, who had fixed her $2 billion machine in 3 minutes, who had answered her careless joke with a quiet and serious question, and who had walked away afterward without saying a single word about who he was. There was one more thing in the file that she had not expected. Among the names listed as witnesses to the intellectual property transfer agreement, the people who had formally observed and countersigned the arrangement, was a name she recognized immediately: Harrison Clark, her father, who had been at that time one of the primary investors in Helix Dynamics, who had used that investment position as the foundation for what would later become Orbit Crest Technologies, who had handed her the company as a 30th birthday gift and called it the product of his vision. Vanessa Clark drove home in the dark and did not turn on the radio. She found Ethan the following afternoon by following the Premier Facilities Group work schedule, which her office manager obtained by calling the company's dispatch line and claiming to be confirming a maintenance appointment. He was at a mid-rise office building 6 blocks from Orbit Crest, resetting a series of circuit breakers on the 14th floor. She waited in the lobby until he came down. When he saw her standing there, he stopped walking. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding something. "I know who you are," she said. "I know what happened." Ethan said nothing. "I want to explain." "There's nothing to explain." He started walking toward the exit. "Everything was handled legally. You can check the documents." "I did check them." She followed him out to the sidewalk. "I checked all of them, including my father's signature." That stopped him. He stood on the sidewalk with the afternoon light coming across his face and looked at her. And the look was not angry. Anger would have been easier. It was something older and more settled than anger. The expression of someone who had processed a particular injury over so many years that it had become simply a part of the landscape, something they no longer fought against, but merely lived with. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. And then, because she was not, in the end, capable of being dishonest in the moments that mattered most, "I'm sorry." He looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he started walking again. She followed him for half a block before he stopped and turned. "I have to pick up my daughter," he said. She did not know, until that moment, about the daughter. His apartment was in a neighborhood that was not poor in the dramatic sense that appears in stories about poverty, but poor in the specific, grinding, relentless sense that comes from not having enough of anything, not enough space, not enough time, not enough money to replace things when they broke. So you repaired them, and repaired them again, and learned to accept the particular texture of life, defined by constant small-scale problem-solving. The apartment had 3 rooms, and a view of a parking structure, and a kitchen table with a slightly uneven leg that had been shimmed with a folded piece of cardboard. There were books everywhere. That was the thing Vanessa noticed first, not the smallness of the space or the second-hand furniture, but the books, stacked in shelves that lined every available wall and piled on surfaces in arrangements that suggested they were consulted regularly and not merely displayed. And drawings. Dozens of drawings pinned to a board in the hallway, a child's drawings of planets and machines, and one recurring figure she would later understand was supposed to be the cosmic sphere, drawn in crayon by a child who had grown up hearing her father talk about the thing he had made. The child herself appeared from the back room and stopped when she saw Vanessa. She was 8 years old with her father's eyes, and the particular self-possessed quality of children who spend a lot of time with adults and have learned to evaluate people quickly. "Who's she?" Lily asked. "Someone from work," Ethan said. Lily considered this. "The fancy work or the cleaning work?" "The fancy work," Ethan said. Lily looked at Vanessa with the frank assessment of someone who had not yet learned to disguise their judgments. "You don't look sorry," she said. Vanessa did not have an answer for that, but Lily had already moved on, asking her father about dinner. Dragging him toward the kitchen, with the easy authority of children who understand precisely how much they are loved, Vanessa stood near the door and watched Ethan Cole, who was also Ethan Mercer, who was also the man who had created the technology that had made her family rich, crouch down and respond to his daughter's questions about school with complete and genuine attention, and she felt something she was not accustomed to feeling, which was the specific shame of someone who has been careless with things that mattered to other people. The board of directors at Orbit Crest had known about Ethan Cole long before Vanessa found the archived documents. She understood this within 48 hours, when she began asking careful questions and received answers that were either too smooth or too evasive to be honest. The board had known, because several of them had been part of the original investor group that had engineered the intellectual property transfer. They had rebuilt the company on top of the architecture Ethan Cole had designed, expanded it with teams of engineers who had worked from his blueprints without knowing whose blueprints they were, and had managed his absence from the official record with the kind of careful institutional memory management that powerful organizations are very good at when the alternative is inconvenient. They had never expected him to resurface. They had certainly not expected him to fix the cosmic sphere in front of 400 witnesses in a maintenance uniform. The board's first move, once they understood that Vanessa had found the documents, was not to explain themselves. It was to move. Within 72 hours of her discovery, a coordinated leak reached 3 technology news outlets. The story described an unnamed former contractor who had attempted to sabotage Orbit Crest's flagship demonstration and had been identified by security personnel. It did not name Ethan directly. It was careful not to do anything legally actionable, but it described him in enough specific detail that anyone paying attention would make the connection. The implication was clear. The man who had appeared on stage was not a hero. He was a threat. The comment sections filled quickly, with the particular cruelty of internet communities responding to a narrative they had been handed by people who wanted a specific emotional outcome. Vanessa read the articles in her office and felt something shift in her chest, a physical sensation, like a gear engaging. She had been raised to think about decisions in terms of their structural consequences. What does this cost? What does this produce? What does this protect? She had run 6 years of a company on that framework, and it had served her well, because the framework was correct as far as it went. What it did not account for was the category of things that were simply wrong, regardless of what they cost or produced or protected. She called her communications director and told him to prepare a public statement. He suggested caution. She told him to prepare the statement. She also did something she had not planned. She drove to Lily's school. She did not have a clear intention when she parked outside. She told herself she was checking on the situation, observing, gathering information. She sat in her car for 10 minutes watching the schoolyard through the windshield, and then she saw Lily standing at the edge of the playground with the specific spatial arrangement of a child who has been excluded not dramatically, not cruelly enough to require adult intervention, just quietly left out, standing a few feet from a group of her classmates who had grouped themselves in a way that didn't include her. One of the other children said something that Vanessa couldn't hear through the car window. Lily looked at the ground. She didn't cry. She just looked at the ground with the patient stoicism of a child who has had practice with this particular experience, and that was somehow worse than crying would have been. Vanessa got out of the car. She did not go into the school and make a scene. She did not confront the other children or demand accountability from the teachers or insert herself into a situation that was not hers to manage. She waited until the end of the school day, and when Lily came out and saw her standing by the gate, the girl stopped and looked at her with wary intelligence. "My dad didn't do anything wrong," Lily said. Before Vanessa could respond, "I know," Vanessa said. "Then why are people saying he did?" Vanessa crouched down so she was at eye level with the child. It was not something she did automatically. She had to remind herself to do it, and the reminder made her feel, briefly, like she was learning to do something she should have always known. "Because some people are scared," she said. "When people are scared, they sometimes say things that aren't true to protect themselves." Lily considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "That's not right," she said. "No," Vanessa said. "It's not." On the way home, she stopped at a bookstore and bought 3 books she had noticed. Lily didn't have in the apartment books about engineering and space, and one that was specifically about women who had changed the history of technology because Lily had asked her once, in the brief conversation they'd had in the apartment hallway, whether it was possible to be an inventor if you weren't good at math yet. She left them at the apartment door without a note. She was not sure why. Or, she was sure, but not yet ready to admit it. The crisis broke open fully on a Thursday afternoon, when Orbit Crest's primary government contract partner announced they were pausing the pending agreement, pending an internal review. The review, it was made clear through the language of the announcement, had been prompted by questions about the company's intellectual property chain of custody questions that had emerged from reporting on the Ethan Cole situation, which had, by this point, become a story that the technology press was covering with the appetite that follows a narrative that promises ongoing revelation. The board called an emergency session and summoned Vanessa. She came. She sat at the long table in the 42nd floor conference room and listened to 4 senior board members and 2 outside legal advisors explain why the correct strategic response was to maintain the current position, to hold the narrative, to let the legal structure speak for itself, to manage Ethan Cole's claims through the established dispute process which would, they were confident, resolve in the company's favor through a combination of statute of limitations, arguments, and the enforceability of the original signed transfer agreement. Vanessa listened to all of it. She listened carefully and completely, which was something she had always done, because she believed you understood a position best by hearing it articulated at its strongest. When they finished, she said, "Everything you've described is legal. None of it is right." The room was quiet. "Ethan Cole designed the foundational architecture of this technology," she said. "He was coerced into surrendering ownership of it. The company's current structure is built on that coercion. I understand that resolving this creates significant legal and financial complexity. I don't particularly care." The board chair, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had been with the company since the Helix Dynamics days, looked at her with the expression of someone who has just realized that the useful tool they have been holding has developed an unexpected edge. "Vanessa," he said carefully, "I would strongly encourage you to consider the broader implications." "I am," she said. "Ethan Cole is going to be publicly acknowledged as the original creator of the cosmic sphere. He is going to receive appropriate compensation, and we are going to restructure the intellectual property record to reflect the truth." She paused. "That's not a proposal. I'm informing you." The vote to suspend her CEO authority was called 3 days later. It passed. The suspension was framed publicly as a temporary leadership review prompted by concerns about decision-making under stress language that was both technically accurate and specifically designed to be humiliating. Vanessa was escorted from the building by security in a way that was managed to be visible to as many staff members as possible, which she understood as a message directed not just at her, but at anyone else who might be considering a similar position. She stood on the sidewalk outside Orbit Crest headquarters for a moment, looking up at the building she had spent 6 years in. Then she called Ethan. "They voted me out," she said, when he answered. There was a pause. "I know. I saw the announcement." Another pause. "Are you all right?" The question was so simple and so direct that it caught her off guard. She had been prepared for anger, or satisfaction, or complicated silence. She had not been prepared for someone to ask if she was all right. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "That's usually an honest answer," he said. He came to find her an hour later. He arrived at the coffee shop where she was sitting with her laptop and a cup of tea she hadn't touched. And he sat down across from her. And for a long time, neither of them said anything. Then Ethan said, "You didn't have to do what you did." "Yes, I did," she said. He looked at her. He was assessing her, she understood. Not unkindly the way you assess something you want to believe but have learned to be careful about believing. "Why?" he asked. She thought about the archive room floor. She thought about Lily at the edge of the playground. She thought about her father's signature on a document that had cost a man everything he'd built. "Because the company I've been running was built on something that was taken from you," she said. "And I don't want to run something like that. I don't want to be someone who runs something like that." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's going to cost you a great deal." "It already has," she said. He looked at the untouched tea. "You should drink that," he said. "You look like you haven't eaten." She laughed a real laugh, small and unprepared, the kind that surfaces when you have been under sufficient pressure for long enough that humor ambushes you through the defenses. He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen him come close to it, and it changed his face in a way she hadn't expected. Over the following 2 weeks, Vanessa moved her work to a small rented space that contained a desk, 3 chairs, and a window that looked onto an alley. Ethan came in the evenings, after Lily was in bed at her neighbor's apartment, to work on the documentation they were assembling, the original designs, the development journals, the time-stamped source code from the prototype period, the witness statements from 3 engineers who had worked alongside Ethan in the Helix Dynamics days, and who had, for various reasons, stayed silent for years, but were willing now to be counted. The evidence was extensive, and, Ethan's attorney confirmed, more than sufficient to support a reconstruction of the intellectual property record. They worked well together, in a way that surprised both of them. Vanessa had built her professional identity around speed and authority, and the specific competence of someone who always knows more than the room expects. Ethan worked differently, slowly, precisely, with a patience for detail that she recognized as the opposite of carelessness and the specific texture of intelligence that does not need to perform. She found herself, for the first time in memory, in a working environment where she was not the most knowledgeable person in the space, and the experience was stranger and more interesting than she had anticipated. One evening she asked him the question she had been carrying since the archive room. "Why didn't you fight them when it happened?" Ethan was looking at a schematic on his laptop. He didn't look up immediately. "Sarah was very sick," he said. "I had maybe 3 months before the financial options ran out. Fighting would have taken 18 months at minimum. And the outcome wasn't certain." He paused. "She needed me present. She didn't need me to be right. She needed me to be there." Vanessa said nothing. "After she was gone," he continued, "I thought about it. I had a young daughter, and no money, and a legal case I'd have to fund myself against people with very good lawyers, and I was tired in a way that doesn't have a good description." He finally looked up. "I decided that the thing I had built was going to matter or not matter on its own. I didn't need to be attached to it for it to be real." "But you're attached to it," Vanessa said quietly. "I can see it when you look at it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't go away," he said. "You just learn to carry it differently." It was during this period that Lily decided she liked Vanessa. The decision appeared to be made without fanfare or announcement one evening, when Ethan brought Lily to the workspace, because her neighbor had a family event, and there was no other option. The child settled into the 3rd chair with a book, and occasionally asked Vanessa questions about what she was working on. Vanessa answered them with the same seriousness she brought to conversations with adults. Lily responded to this with the particular warmth children reserve for adults who treat their questions as worth answering. At one point, Lily looked up from her book and said, "My dad made the sphere, you know." "I know," Vanessa said. "He never told me not to talk about it. But I figured out he didn't want me to." Vanessa looked at Ethan. He was studying a document and appeared to be paying no attention to this exchange, which she was fairly certain meant he was paying complete attention. That was probably to protect you, Vanessa said. From what? From being upset about something that couldn't be changed. Lily thought about this. But now it can be changed, she said. Yes, Vanessa said. Now it can. The public hearing was held on a Tuesday in a conference room at the Federal Patent Office, with legal representation on both sides and 3 technology journalists permitted to observe. Vanessa had organized the event after a month of preliminary legal maneuvering, during which Orbitcrest's board, now under interim CEO Philip Hartley, had attempted through various procedural mechanisms to delay the process. The attempts failed, partly because the documentation was extensive, and partly because 2 of the 3 government contract partners had signaled their preference for transparency. Ethan presented the original design documentation in sequence, the early sketches, the prototype journals, the source code with its original timestamps. He presented it without drama, simply laying out the evidence as it existed. The witnesses confirmed the timeline. The board's legal team attempted several cross-examinations that went poorly. Vanessa was not a party to the legal proceedings. She had no standing in the intellectual property dispute itself. But she was present as an observer, and she sat in the back row for 6 hours and watched the record of what had happened be established, formally and finally, in a proceeding that would be reported and documented and available to anyone who wanted to understand how the cosmic sphere had actually come into existence. Near the end of the day, Gerald Whitmore, who had been present throughout, looked across the room at Ethan Cole with an expression that was difficult to read, precisely but contained within it, something that was not quite remorse and not quite acknowledgement, but occupied the uncomfortable space between them. Ethan looked back at him without particular emotion. He had said his piece. The record existed now. That was what he had come for. The settlement that followed took another 6 weeks to finalize. It included the formal recognition of Ethan Cole as the original inventor and architectural designer of the cosmic sphere. It included financial compensation that his attorney described as substantial, and that Ethan described as less important than the credit. It included a restructuring of Orbitcrest's intellectual property records to accurately reflect the history of the technology's development. Ethan had decided, after a long conversation with his attorney and a longer one with himself, that pursuing criminal charges would cost more of his time and attention than the outcome was worth. Philip Hartley resigned as interim CEO within 10 days of the settlement. 3 board members stepped down in the following 2 weeks. The remaining board members, faced with the task of rebuilding the company's credibility with its government partners and investor base, reached out to Vanessa Clark with a proposal that she had not expected. They offered her the CEO position back. She declined. What she proposed instead was a co-leadership structure herself and Ethan Cole, jointly, with restructured governance that included mandatory transparency mechanisms and an independent oversight board. It was not a conventional arrangement. It was not what any of them had imagined when the week began. But the government partners, when it was presented to them, expressed something approaching relief. The investor base, when it was communicated, responded with a cautious but genuine interest. The press, when it was announced, generated the kind of coverage that is driven by a story that ends differently than expected. Ethan received the news at the small rented workspace late on a Friday afternoon. Vanessa had come to tell him in person, which she had decided was the correct way to communicate things that mattered. She explained the proposal. She explained what it would mean for the company, for the technology, for the people who worked there, nearly 2,000 of them, who had spent the last 2 months in a specific kind of professional anxiety that is the particular torment of working for an institution whose leadership is visibly collapsing. She explained what it would mean for Lily, in terms of stability and the future and the particular dignity of being the daughter of a man whose name was attached, correctly, to the thing he had made. When she finished, Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the desk in front of him, the desk in the small rented space where they had spent the last several weeks reassembling the truth, and then he looked at her. "I need to think about this," he said. "I know," she said. "There's something else I need to ask you first." She waited. "What you said on stage that night," he said. "The joke." She felt the specific heat of memory. "That was careless," she said. "I know it was careless. I was frightened, and I used you as a punchline. And I am sorry for that. In a way that is more than professional." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "I'm not asking for an apology," he said. "I'm asking whether you meant it." The question entered the room differently than questions usually do, not as a challenge, not with any aggression in it, but with the quality of directness that belongs to people who have learned, through specific experience, that circumlocution costs more than it saves. Vanessa Clark, who had spent 6 years managing the presentation of herself with extraordinary care, did not manage her response to this question. She said, "I didn't mean it when I said it, but I think I mean it now." She paused. "I'm aware that's not the same thing. It might be the better thing," Ethan said. He organized the press event himself, which surprised her. She had expected to manage it. It was the kind of thing she managed, had always managed, knew how to manage precisely. But Ethan came to her office 2 days later, with a plan already outlined that was simple and direct and, she had to acknowledge, more effective than anything her communications team had drafted. No elaborate production. No manufactured spectacle. A room. An audience. A statement. And a record. The event was held in a medium-sized conference venue on a gray morning, with approximately 150 people attending: press, employees, several of the government representatives, a few investors. Vanessa spoke first. She acknowledged the history of the technology. She acknowledged her father's role in it. She acknowledged that she had built her professional identity on a foundation she had not fully examined, and that the examination, when it finally came, had been both necessary and overdue. She said these things without the performance of humility, without the stagecraft of public remorse that people use when they want to be seen repenting, rather than actually engaging with what they have done. She said them the way she had learned, over the last several months, to say difficult things simply, directly, with the weight they deserved. Then Ethan spoke. He did not speak for long. He said that what he wanted, and what he had always wanted, was for the work to be credited correctly. Because the work was real and it mattered, and the people who would build on it deserved to know where it came from. He said that what happened to him had made him understand things about the relationship between power and creativity that he could not have understood otherwise, and that he did not regret the years he had spent away from the industry because they had given him Lily. And Lily was the most important thing he had ever been part of. He said that going forward he hoped to contribute to a company that would operate differently, not perfectly, but with the kind of intentional transparency that made future corrections possible. At the end of his remarks, he paused for a moment. Then he said, "I was told someone made me a promise about 6 months ago. I thought about it for a long time." He looked at Vanessa. "I decided I'd rather hold her to it than let her off the hook." There was a beat of silence in the room. And then laughter, not the sharp, dismissive laughter of the convention hall, but the warmer, more inclusive laughter of a room of people who understood they were watching something real. Vanessa was laughing too, though her eyes were bright in a way that was not entirely dry. The months that followed were not easy. Companies do not restructure without pain. People do not change without friction. There were board meetings that were exhausting and legal processes that were slow, and moments when remaking something built on a flawed foundation felt like exactly the kind of thing reasonable people would have declined to attempt. But the work was real. The underlying reality of the technology, which had always been extraordinary, and the underlying reality of the people doing the work, most of whom had not known the full history of what they were building, and who, when they learned it, responded with the combination of anger at the past and investment in the future that defines institutions capable of genuine repair. Ethan established an engineering fellowship program in the first year, a fund for early-stage inventors without institutional backing, the people working in spaces the mainstream industry did not look at. He named it after Sarah. He had told Lily before the public announcement, and Lily had been quiet for a moment, and then said, with the gravity of a child processing something large, "She would have liked that." Ethan agreed that she would have. Vanessa moved into a role she had not previously occupied, learning from a situation rather than managing it. She had always been a fast learner, but she had directed that capacity toward accumulating advantage. What she was learning now was different. The cost of carelessness. What is lost when institutions prioritize protection over truth? The specific weight people carry when the systems around them decide their story is inconvenient. She learned it from Ethan, from Lily, and from the employees at Orbitcrest who began, in the months after the restructuring, to say things they had previously declined to say about processes and hierarchies, and the ways the company's culture had discouraged the honest communication that innovation requires. She listened. She changed what she could change, and acknowledged what had not yet been changed. The launch of the next generation cosmic sphere was scheduled for 18 months after the restructuring. Vanessa and Ethan reviewed the final specifications together in the week before the event, working through a checklist that was thorough in the way that thoroughness had, for both of them, become a value rather than just a practice. The room where they worked was different from the archive room floor and the small rented space and the Orbitcrest conference rooms where so many of the consequential conversations had taken place. It was the newly renovated design lab on the 6th floor, with windows that looked out over the city and a wall covered in Lily's drawings with her father's permission. She had been allowed to display them there because someone on the design team had noticed them and said they should be somewhere people could see them. And the suggestion had been acted upon. On the morning of the launch, Vanessa arrived early. She stood in the exhibition hall, not the Nexus Grand, a different venue, smaller and more considered, and looked at the cosmic sphere in its housing. It was more beautiful than the previous version, in the way that things become more beautiful when their history is accurately known, not despite the difficulty, but partly because of it. She was still looking at it when she heard the sound of a maintenance cart in the hallway. A facilities employee rounded the corner, pushing a cart with a loose wheel that rattled against the floor. He was focused on the cart, not watching where he was going, and when he passed the open door of the exhibition hall, a wrench slid off the cart and hit the floor with a sharp clang. Vanessa walked over and picked it up. The employee looked up, startled, and registered who she was with the slightly uncertain expression of someone reconciling two categories that don't usually overlap. "Thank you," he said. "Of course," Vanessa said, and handed it back. She turned to find Ethan standing in the doorway of the hall, watching. He had arrived without her noticing, which she was increasingly used to. He had the particular quality of being present without announcement, of occupying space without requiring it to reorganize around him. He was watching her with an expression she had come to recognize as his version of warmth, which was quieter than other people's warmth but no less real. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. They stood together in the exhibition hall for a moment, looking at the cosmic sphere. Outside, the city was waking up. In a few hours, the room would fill again. In a few hours, there would be an audience, and statements to be made, and a technology to be launched under a name and a history that were now, finally, correct. But in that moment it was just the two of them, and the machine that one of them had made, and both of them had fought for. Glowing quietly in its housing, perfect and specific and real, Ethan reached over and took her hand. She let him. There is something the world does not do well, which is notice the people who hold it together. The maintenance workers, the people in the gray uniforms moving through the corridors of the places where other people make their decisions, doing the quiet work that keeps the systems running. They are present at nearly every significant moment, and absent from nearly every record of those moments. They carry the buildings. They carry the infrastructure. Sometimes, occasionally, they carry the ideas that become the technologies that change the way humanity understands its relationship to the universe it inhabits. They do this without acknowledgement, often for years, sometimes for the entirety of a life that goes unrecognized by the institutions that benefit from their contribution. The cosmic sphere, when it launched that morning, bore Ethan Cole's name in the design specifications, in the founding documentation, in the plaque mounted beside its housing in every venue it would ever inhabit. His name would appear in the engineering histories. It would appear in the textbooks that would be written about the period. It would appear in the fellowship applications of young inventors who would learn his story and take from it the particular courage that comes from understanding that genius is not protected by the rooms in which it occurs, that it can exist in a gray uniform, that it can fix what others cannot fix, create what others cannot imagine, and survive the years of being unseen with its essential nature intact. Real talent does not always arrive in the rooms built to receive it. It sometimes arrives with a mop and a broken zipper on a tool bag, moving through a corridor that runs beneath the stage, waiting with perfect patience for the moment when the machine it made needs the one person who knows exactly how to bring it home. The rest, as Lily would say, is just what happens next.